millionaire forbids his wife from leaving the house out of jealousy and goes to a party alone. When he returns, he can't believe what he saw. Jack Carter strode from the mansion with unshakable confidence, adjusting his tie in a calculated motion, as if preparing for a grand entrance into Chicago's elite society. From the towering front door, Emily Davis watched him with a mixture of frustration and resignation. Tonight, like so many others, he would attend one of the exclusive business galas, while she remained confined within the house under the pretense of being better protected. "Don't insist, Emily. I've told you 1,000 times. That's not a place for you," he had said only moments earlier, his condescending tone closing off any further discussion. Dressed in a simple silk dress she rarely wore, Emily clenched her hands tightly, willing them not to tremble. She had stopped responding to him long ago, not from a lack of words, but because she knew that every argument she made would only crash against the unyielding wall of Jack's will. "The world isn't kind, Emily. What do you think would happen if someone had the nerve to criticize you? I won't expose you to that kind of humiliation," he had added, as if his controlling nature were an act of selfless love. When the sound of his car's engine faded into the distance, Emily felt the entire house sink into a stifling silence. She walked slowly toward the main hall, where the walls, adorned with works of art and designer furniture, failed to mask the emptiness that filled every corner. The mansion, a palace that should have symbolized her privileged life, had become a gilded cage, restricting her movements and dimming her dreams. In the early years of her marriage, Emily had found comfort in Jack's words. His protective nature and dazzling success had convinced her he was the perfect man. But over time, that love which once made her feel special had morphed into a set of rules that isolated her. Every decision, no matter how small or large, was made by him. Each morning began the same. Jack would peruse the news while giving her precise instructions. What to wear, who to receive at the house, even which topics were suitable for the few guests he allowed. Any deviation from these rules was met with a reprimand, disguised as concern. He never raised his voice, but his words carried a weight Emily couldn't contradict. "Image is everything, Emily. My success depends on how the world perceives me," he would often repeat, almost like a mantra. This obsession with his reputation extended to his insistence on keeping her out of the public eye. According to Jack, any slip-up, any misplaced word from her could endanger his flawless facade as an invulnerable magnate. To him, Emily was a delicate piece to be kept hidden, away from the prying eyes that might uncover cracks in his perfect life. The young woman walked toward the window that overlooked the garden. The city lights shimmered in the distance, reminding her of a world that seemed just out of reach. She thought back to the days before she met Jack, when she had worked in her small art gallery, dreaming of traveling the world, creating and exhibiting her works. All of that had become a distant memory. Now, her only role was to be the ideal wife, a decorative figure to be available when he deemed it necessary. Though luxury surrounded her, Emily felt as if she had lost something essential, her freedom. She sat on the sofa and looked around. Everything was in its place, immaculate, as though life itself were forbidden within those walls. The housemaids barely exchanged words with her, always maintaining the professional distance that Jack demanded. The sound of water cascading from the small fountain in the garden was the only sound that pierced the oppressive silence of the mansion. Emily spent hours in that space, surrounded by tall walls and meticulously cared for greenery. It was the only place where she felt she could breathe, free from Jack's critical gaze. Tending to the flowers had become her sole distraction, a routine that filled the endless days and kept her mind from sinking too deeply into the void that consumed her. She crouched down to trim the dry leaves from a rose bush, the soft breeze stirring the branches around her. Her once delicate fingers, now roughened by the constant touch of soil, glided gently over the red petals, with a tenderness she could no longer find in her own life. There alone, Emily whispered thoughts she would never dare speak aloud. If only I could leave here, feel the real world, she thought to herself, her hands moving almost mechanically as though they were the only part of her capable of truly acting. The garden was her only window to freedom, yet even there, she could not escape Jack's suffocating presence. The strategically placed security cameras lurking in the corners were a constant reminder that even in this small refuge, she was never completely alone. When she finished caring for the plants, Emily walked slowly to a stone bench in the center of the garden, where a small table held a hidden notebook. It was here that she wrote letters to herself, silent outpourings that transformed her pain into words. She picked up the well-worn notebook and the pen she kept tucked in the pocket of her dress. Her fingers hesitated for a moment before she began to write. Today, like every other day, I am here, tending the flowers, trying to fill the emptiness with something I can't name. Jack is at another party, likely surrounded by people who admire him. And me? I wonder who I am, because the woman who once dreamed of traveling, painting and feeling the sun on her face seems to no longer exist. Emily set the pen down and sighed, looking at the page already filled with other similar confessions. She knew these words would never be read by anyone. They were merely an echo of her trapped soul. She closed the notebook carefully and tucked it away again, as though she feared even the wind might reveal her secrets. Returning to the house, the emptiness felt even more profound. The staff was there, as always, performing their tasks with precision, but none of them offered more than a brief nod of acknowledgement. Jack had made it clear that his relationship with them should remain distant. They're employees, not friends, he would say. That coldness hurt, but she lacked the strength to contradict him. Emily made her way to the living room, where a stack of freshly arrived magazines sat on the table. She picked one up absent-mindedly, but when she opened it, she saw a photo of Jack at a lavish reception. He stood next to influential business figures, wearing that confident smile that had so often disarmed her in the past. The caption read, "Jack Carter, the perfect example of success and elegance." A lump formed in Emily's throat. While he was hailed as an exemplary man, she remained a shadow, hidden and invisible to the world. The days blurred into one another, a monotony too unbearable to escape. The luxury surrounding her, fine wood furniture, imposing chandeliers, expensive dresses hanging in the closet, felt meaningless, hollow. Emily didn't feel as though she possessed any of it, not even herself. Increasingly, the weight of her isolation made her question who she was. I'm no longer Emily. I'm just Jack Carter's wife, she thought, walking down the main hallway, which seemed longer and colder with each passing day. The only time she felt something resembling relief was when she gazed out of her bedroom window and saw the city lights in the distance. They sparkled like a call, as though the world beyond was waiting for her, offering a life she could no longer reach. If you're watching this far, I'm sure you're enjoying it, so I want to ask you to subscribe to the channel. The morning began with the usual cold silence that enveloped the mansion. Emily stood in the garden, as she did every day, trimming the flowers in a futile attempt to escape the emptiness that consumed her. But today, something in the air felt different. Jack had spent breakfast on the phone, his voice laced with formality and enthusiasm. Odd, considering his typical indifference in domestic matters. When the call ended, he entered the living room where Emily was arranging magazines on the coffee table. I have a very important gala in New York this weekend, Jack announced, as if expecting applause for his packed schedule. He wore a perfectly tailored suit even at home, each detail meticulously in place, a reflection of his obsessive need for flawless appearances. Though accustomed to such announcements, Emily briefly looked up, searching for some hint of inclusion in his words, some invitation that, deep down, she knew would never come. Still, she mustered the courage to ask, her voice barely above a whisper. "Can I go with you?" The air seemed to freeze for a moment. Jack stared at her as though she'd asked an absurd question. With a slight, ironic chuckle, he shook his head. "Emily, you know these events aren't for women like you. They're hostile environments full of delicate negotiations. I can't afford distractions. It's better for you to stay here, where it's safe, where you belong." His words struck Emily like a slap. For a brief second she considered responding, questioning why she was treated like a mere ornament that couldn't even be paraded in public. But she held back. It wasn't fear, but a deep exhaustion from fighting against barriers that seemed insurmountable. She simply nodded, but her eyes betrayed a growing fatigue, one that was slowly evolving into resistance. On Saturday, as Jack prepared for his trip, Emily watched him from a distance. He seemed more animated than usual, adjusting his tie in front of the hall mirror. The gala would take place at a luxurious hotel in Manhattan, one of the city's most sophisticated neighborhoods. Jack spoke about the international investors who would be attending, emphasizing the importance of making a good impression. This event could open enormous doors for the company's future contracts. "Everything has to go perfectly," he said, donning his jacket and giving one last approving glance at his reflection. Standing silently by the stairs, Emily felt more out of place than ever. With each word, it became clearer that for Jack, the world outside the mansion was a realm where she had no place. When he finally left, accompanied by the chauffeur, Emily remained motionless in the hallway, the sound of the car's tires fading into the distance. The silence of the house seemed more suffocating than ever. As the hours passed, Emily wandered through the rooms like a lost soul. She stopped at the window in the bedroom, gazing at the city lights on the horizon. Something inside her began to stir, a faint spark of rebellion growing slowly. She knew Jack's absence offered a rare opportunity, yet she still fought against the fear that paralyzed her. That night, the mansion felt less like a home and more like a crumbling fortress. Emily sensed for the first time that if she didn't act to change her circumstances, she would completely lose herself. Sitting in the armchair in her room, she stared into the mirror, seeing a reflection of a woman she barely recognized. That had to change. Jack, preoccupied with impressing his guests at the gala, remained oblivious to what was unfolding in his absence. His control over Emily was so absolute that he never considered she might challenge his rules. But that very night, Emily would begin to entertain the impossible thought, taking the first step toward reclaiming what she had lost of herself. The night was unusually quiet at the Carter mansion. Emily, sitting on the edge of the bed, stared at the emptiness. The sound of the clock ticking seemed to echo in her mind, each tick a reminder of her monotonous, imprisoning routine. Jack was far away, lost in the gala in New York, and for the first time in years, she felt that his absence created something new, a possibility. Fear and courage waged a battle within her. The idea of leaving felt as tempting as it was terrifying. Emily knew Jack would never accept such an attitude, but at the same time, the thirst for freedom had become unbearable. Her eyes turned toward the mirror, where she saw not just her reflection, but the shadow of a woman she no longer wanted to be. Tonight would be different. As she hesitated on the stairs, she noticed Rose, the oldest servant in the house, quietly tidying the kitchen. Rose was always a calming presence, but her eyes betrayed a mix of concern and empathy. Emily approached slowly, trying to mask her nervousness. "Rose, I need your help," she said in a barely audible whisper. The woman looked up, surprised. She had never seen Emily so determined. She set the rag aside, crossed her arms, and leaned in slightly to listen. "I want to go out, just for a few hours," Emily continued, feeling the weight of her words. I need to breathe." Rose paused for a moment, assessing the situation. She knew it was a huge risk, but she also saw how trapped Emily was in that house. Finally, she nodded in agreement. "Are you sure?" she asked softly. "If he finds out, I don't care. I can't live like this anymore." With a determined look, Rose quickly set to work. She pulled a simple dress from Emily's wardrobe, something discreet that wouldn't draw attention, and suggested she wear a scarf to partially cover her face. "It's better if no one recognizes you," Rose explained as she helped Emily get dressed. Within minutes, Emily was ready. Her hands trembled as she opened the back door, her heart pounding so loudly it seemed to echo in the empty hallway. Rose accompanied her to the garden door, where she discreetly handed Emily some money. "Be careful, madam, and come back before anyone notices." Emily nodded, unable to speak. The cool night air enveloped her as she stepped outside. A chill ran through her as she glanced at the street, but she took her first step, then another, until her feet moved with more confidence. She walked to the nearest taxi stand and, her voice trembling, asked to be taken to downtown Chicago. The ride was silent, but each mile felt like a victory. When she finally arrived, the sight of the illuminated cathedral and the lively plazas took her breath away. It was as if she were waking from a long nightmare. Emily wandered aimlessly through the streets, swept away by the sounds of conversation, the scent of food from street vendors, and the breeze that carried with it the life she had so longed for. She passed the cathedral and entered out of curiosity. Inside, she felt a peace she hadn't experienced in years. She closed her eyes and whispered a silent prayer, as if asking for the strength to carry on. She found a small cafe with tables lining the sidewalk, the scent of fresh coffee mingling with the city's pulse. She ordered a simple coffee, then sat there, quietly observing the world around her. For the first time in years, she felt connected, part of something larger than herself. A smile tugged at her lips as she watched a couple bicker playfully over which pastry to order, while a child chased a red balloon in the breeze. It was as if everything was falling into place, except her own life, but with the warmth of the moment came a shadow. What if Jack found out? What would he do? Her thoughts were interrupted as the waiter brought the bill. She paid, and, as she pocketed the change, felt the weight of reality settling back over her. She had been out too long. Back at the mansion, Rose was waiting anxiously at the door. Emily hurried inside, her heart still racing from the brief freedom she had tasted. She climbed the stairs and shut the door to her room behind her, exhaling in relief. But she knew this small act of defiance was just the beginning of something much greater. The grand ballroom of the luxurious hotel in Manhattan shimmered with light, filled with elaborate decorations and the hum of lively conversations. Influential businessmen, renowned politicians, and a handful of discreet celebrities formed clusters of dialogue, all dressed in the finest couture. It was a scene meant to impress, to cement alliances, exactly the kind of atmosphere in which Jack Carter thrived. He entered with purposeful strides, exuding a confidence that felt almost palpable. Dressed in a bespoke suit, every detail of his appearance conveyed power. Beside him walked Lauren Mitchell, a political consultant known for her sharp mind and ambition. Her dark blue dress was understated yet sophisticated, her eyes gleaming with calculation as she scanned the room for opportunity. As Jack and Lauren crossed the ballroom, all eyes shifted toward them. Jack greeted the guests with firm handshakes and controlled smiles while Lauren stayed near, offering pointed comments that complemented Jack's aura of influence. Together, they formed a duo that not only radiated charisma, but also sparked murmurs among the crowd. "Who is she?" a socialite whispered to her companion, her gaze following Lauren's every move. "They say she's his political consultant, but doesn't seem like that's all she is, does it?" the man replied, raising an eyebrow. The whispers spread swiftly, mingling with the sound of champagne glasses clinking and the constant buzz of conversation. Some commented on Emily's absence, while others hinted that Lauren occupied a more intimate space in Jack's life than he let on. Meanwhile, Jack remained unfazed by the speculation. His focus was elsewhere. At the center of the room, he approached a group of foreign businessmen, initiating a smooth conversation in flawless English about potential partnerships. Every word he spoke was calculated, every gesture meticulously planned to leave the best impression. He knew that tonight, more than ever, his image was his most valuable asset. "Mr. Carter, your business acumen is truly remarkable," one of the businessmen commented, clearly impressed by Jack's clarity and poise. "Success is built on strategy and dedication, Mr. Bradley," Jack replied, offering a slight smile, "and of course, on the right partnerships." Lauren, who had thus far kept a low profile, seized the moment to chime in with a sharp comment that reinforced Jack's points, showcasing her ability to complement his speech without overshadowing him. This interaction did not go unnoticed by the other guests. "They make quite a pair," one of the politicians remarked, eyeing Jack and Lauren. "Maybe too close." Meanwhile, subtle questions about Emily's whereabouts began to emerge. An old acquaintance of Jack's, curious about her absence, tried to broach the subject. "Jack, what about your wife? Isn't Emily coming tonight?" he asked, attempting to sound casual. Jack barely spared him a glance, his response cold and rehearsed. "Emily prefers the peace of home. These events aren't to her liking," he said, swiftly ending the conversation before it could gain any momentum. His answer reinforced the narrative he had crafted over the years, the businessman consumed by ambition, whose personal life was a trivial matter compared to his career. Lauren sensed the indifference in Jack's words, and with subtle grace, redirected the conversation back to business, ensuring the evening flowed seamlessly. But Lauren knew how to use the noise around her to her advantage. Every glance, every whisper about her proximity to Jack was an opportunity to solidify her own position. While he negotiated, she made connections, exchanged calculated smiles, and quietly made her presence felt. By the time the early hours of the morning arrived, the mansion's lights were dim, the air cold, when Jack's car pulled up to the entrance. He got out quickly, adjusting his suit as he walked toward the door. The night had been a success. The investors were impressed, and he felt certain he had further solidified his position as the unshakable magnate he prided himself on being. Yet something unsettled him. It could have been exhaustion or the eerie silence of the house, but an inexplicable feeling hung in the air. As he entered the vast foyer, Jack noted that everything seemed in order, but a slight tension began to stir within him. He placed his keys on the marble table and let out a sigh, allowing himself a moment of relaxation. However, as he walked toward the living room, something out of place caught his eye. The door to Emily's study, upstairs, was ajar. Jack froze, brow furrowing. It was a small detail, but unusual. Emily never left that door open. It was an unspoken rule he had insisted on enforcing, ensuring everything remained in its proper place. He ascended the stairs slowly, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. When he pushed open the door, the first thing he saw was her desk. Resting on it was a sealed envelope, with his name written in delicate handwriting he would recognize anywhere. His heart quickened. With trembling fingers, he took the letter and sat in the leather chair, carefully breaking the seal. The first words hit him like a punch. "Dear Jack, I don't know where to begin, but I feel I must write everything my heart has held for years. I'm tired, not just of the mansion, the silence, or the loneliness, but of being invisible in your life. I was a woman full of dreams before I met you, but today I feel like a shadow within these walls." As Jack read, his expression shifted, The furrow in his brow gave way to an almost incredulous look. The letter continued, detailing Emily's sorrow, her suffocating sense of confinement, and a clear desire to change her life. She didn't mention concrete plans, but the determination in her words was something Jack had never imagined she could possess. When he finished reading, he placed the letter on the desk, his mind spinning. How had he missed this? He had always believed his control was absolute, that Emily accepted her role passively. Now, the mere thought that she might challenge his authority unsettled him. Taking a deep breath, Jack left the study and called for Rose, who appeared swiftly, her expression as neutral as always. "Rose, where's Emily?" he asked, his voice laced with tension. "She's resting, I imagine," Rose replied calmly, but something in her eyes revealed more than her words suggested. Jack stepped closer, narrowing his eyes. "You know something, Rose. Don't lie to me." Rose remained composed, arms crossed, her stance unyielding. "I don't know what you mean. My only concern is Mrs. Emily's well-being." Her answer only deepened Jack's mistrust. He stepped forward, attempting to intimidate her, but Rose didn't flinch. Her loyalty to Emily was apparent, and it infuriated him even more. Unable to get any answers, Jack gave up, running a hand through his hair in frustration. Back in the study, Jack read the letter again and again, trying to piece together clues or understand what had changed. He knew Emily wasn't the same, but he never imagined she would have the courage to express her discontent. Those words revealed that something inside her had awakened, a spark he had failed to extinguish. The control he thought was unshakable was beginning to crumble, and for the first time in years, Jack felt the situation slipping from his grasp. He had always believed his life was predictable, carefully calculated, but Emily, with that letter, had shattered the balance. The weight of the truth pressed down on him. His wife was no longer the submissive woman he thought he could control. The day broke with the same oppressive silence that dominated the Carter mansion, but within its walls, the tension was palpable. Emily sat in the living room, close to the window, a cup of tea untouched in her hands. Her eyes were fixed on the garden, though her mind wandered far beyond it. Since writing the letter and finding the courage to put into words what had been buried for years, something inside her had shifted. She felt stronger, but she knew she would soon face the consequences. The sound of Jack's firm steps echoed down the hall before he appeared in the doorway. Emily didn't turn. She didn't need to. She knew he was coming. When he entered the room, his presence seemed to fill the space, suffocating it with an energy both heavy and charged. He held the letter in his fingers, folded as though it were a weapon primed to strike. "Emily," he began, his voice low but sharp, with an edge of irritation he couldn't mask. "Care to explain this?" Emily finally raised her gaze, locking eyes with him. For the first time in years, she didn't look away. Her voice was calm, but unyielding. "I think the letter is clear, Jack." His eyes widened in surprise. He had expected pleading, excuses, but instead he found directness. He clenched his jaw and began pacing, his gaze fixed on her. "Clear," he repeated, his laughter tinged with disbelief. "You wrote that you're tired, that you want to change your life. What does that mean, Emily? Are you saying I don't give you everything? A house, comfort, security? Isn't that enough?" Emily gripped her cup tighter, her fingers trembling as if the act alone could steady her. Her heart raced, but her expression remained neutral. "It's not about what you give me, Jack. It's about what you take. My freedom, my identity, my voice. I'm not myself anymore." The words came with difficulty, but they hung in the air, defying the absolute authority Jack had always believed he wielded. Jack stopped pacing and faced her, his expression hardening. His anger was clear, but beneath it there was something else. Confusion, perhaps even fear. "You're being ungrateful, Emily," he said, trying to reclaim control of the situation. Everything I do is for you, for our life. I protect you because the world out there isn't what you think. I thought you understood that." Emily rose slowly, each movement deliberate, filled with a quiet determination. She was tired of hearing the same justifications, of living in the shadow of a protection that felt more like a prison. "You're not doing it for me, Jack. You're doing it for you, to maintain your image, your control. I don't want to live like this anymore." The words hit Jack like a jolt. He took a step forward, his imposing stature meant to intimidate. But Emily didn't retreat. Her gaze, once submissive, now burned with resistance. Jack felt something unfamiliar stir within him. Helplessness. "You don't understand what you're saying," he replied, his voice dropping, almost pleading. "Emily, everything we have, everything we are you really willing to throw that away?" "I don't want to throw anything away. I want to find myself again," she said, her voice resolute. Jack tightened his grip on the letter, unsure of what to do next. The woman before him was no longer the one he thought he knew. His confusion deepened. When he finally left the room, Emily felt the weight of his gaze, but she didn't falter. She stood there, staring out at the garden, trying to catch her breath. She knew this conversation was just the beginning. Meanwhile, the staff steered clear of the hallways and rooms where the couple might be. The few who encountered Jack noticed the rising tension, but no one dared speak. Even Rose, who usually exuded authority, seemed more cautious. The mansion, already steeped in silence, now seemed charged, as though everyone was waiting for an explosion. The mansion remained wrapped in a tense quiet, interrupted only by the soft sound of pages turning. Emily stood in Jack's office, a space that had always been considered his exclusive domain. Her decision to enter hadn't been impulsive. After their recent confrontations and the growing strain between them, something inside her had driven her to seek answers. She wasn't entirely sure what she was looking for, but she felt that this place held something important. The office was immaculate, every item meticulously arranged, reflecting Jack's controlling nature. Emily opened the drawers, carefully shifting papers to avoid leaving traces of her presence. As she flipped through contracts and reports that seemed ordinary at first glance, a black leather folder at the bottom of one drawer caught her eye. It had no labels or markings, but its weight suggested it contained something significant. She placed it on the desk, hesitating for a moment before opening it. Inside, she found a series of contracts, letters, and handwritten notes, all connected to a familiar name. Lauren Mitchell. The name sent her heart racing. Emily knew Lauren was close to Jack, but what these documents revealed went far beyond a professional relationship. The papers indicated that Jack was facing serious financial difficulties. Several contracts he had signed contained unusual clauses involving loans and guarantees that were directly tied to Lauren. Some of the letters, carefully folded, showed conversations between them. As Emily pieced it together, the picture became clearer. Jack had diverted funds from crucial projects to maintain his lavish lifestyle, and now he relied on Lauren to prevent complete collapse. But what truly took her breath away was the tone of Lauren's messages. In one, the consultant referred to information she could expose if Jack didn't meet her demands. The words were polite, but a threat lingered beneath every phrase. Lauren held something over Jack, something powerful enough to destroy him if revealed. Emily set the letters down, struggling to process what she had just uncovered. A wave of shock mingled with an odd sense of satisfaction. For years, Jack had projected an image of strength and invulnerability, controlling every facet of her life. But here, in these papers, was the evidence that he wasn't as untouchable as he appeared. His perfect world was built on secrets and lies, and now she held the key to them. For a few minutes, Emily stood frozen, staring at the documents before her. Then, with deliberate care, she gathered the letters and returned them to the folder, but not before committing the most crucial details to memory. She knew confronting Jack directly was unwise. Not yet. He still held power over her, and a poorly timed confrontation could have disastrous consequences. Yet something within her had shifted. The discovery gave her a new kind of leverage in their relationship. An ace she could play if Jack ever tried to intimidate her again. For the first time, Emily felt as though she could stand on equal footing with him. As she closed the drawer and left the office, her mind raced. It wasn't just what she had uncovered about Lauren and Jack's financial struggles. It was the realization that he too was vulnerable, and that vulnerability, which he had always tried to conceal, was now in her hands. It was a weapon, one she could wield. Upon leaving the office, Emily crossed paths with Rose in the hallway. The servant cast a curious glance her way, but said nothing. Emily, for her part, offered a small, rare smile. It was subtle, yet heavy with determination. She wasn't sure what she would do with the information she'd discovered, but for the first time in years, she knew she held an advantage. The morning brought an unusual clarity to Emily's room. Sunlight filtered through the slightly parted curtains, casting a soft warmth over the space. Still lying in bed, her gaze fixed on the ceiling, her thoughts swirled around the recent events. The revelation of Jack's secrets had opened a door within her, one she couldn't close. The awareness that he too was vulnerable sparked a courage she didn't know she had. For the first time in years, Emily felt she could take control of her life, even if that meant challenging the man who had dominated it for so long. After breakfast, Emily waited patiently until Jack left for a meeting. He seemed more distant, more suspicious than usual, casting occasional glances in her direction as he adjusted his tie. But Emily remained calm, pretending indifference as always. When she finally heard the car pull away, a wave of relief washed over her. She knew this would be the perfect moment. Soon after, with Rose's discreet help, Emily swapped her luxurious dress for something simple and casual. She grabbed a small handbag, making sure to carry only the essentials. Unlike the first time she ventured out in secret, this time she felt no paralyzing fear. Her resolve was stronger now than any fear she had. Emily hailed a taxi and headed for Tlaquepaque, a neighborhood that held fond memories of her youth. The cobbled streets, the little craft shops, and the musicians playing in the plazas brought a warmth she hadn't felt in years. As she walked, her eyes absorbed every detail, from the vibrant hues of the buildings to the mouth-watering smells of food wafting from the street vendors. It was during this stroll that she ran into Carmen, a childhood friend she hadn't seen in decades. The reunion was as unexpected as it was joyous. Carmen was sitting at one of the outdoor cafe tables, laughing with a group of people when her eyes met Emily's. "Emily, I can't believe it!" Carmen exclaimed, rising instantly to embrace her. The warmth of the hug brought tears to Emily's eyes. She had forgotten what it was like to be welcomed with affection, without judgment or suffocating expectations. The two women sat together, and soon Carmen introduced her to her friends. They were simple people, with real stories and genuine smiles, a stark contrast to the cold, calculated world Emily had come to know in the mansion. During their conversation, Emily spoke little about her current life, merely saying she was married and didn't get out much. But Carmen, perceptive as ever, seemed to sense something deeper. With a careful tone, she asked, "Are you happy, Emily?" The question caught her off guard. Happy? It had been so long since she'd even thought about that, she didn't know how to respond. Instead, she diverted her gaze, feigning interest in something distant. Carmen didn't press further, but Emily knew that question would linger in her mind for days to come. Later, Carmen suggested they take a walk through the main plaza. There, Emily encountered more familiar faces, people who had been part of her life before Jack. Each reunion brought a sense of belonging that she hadn't realized still existed. For the first time in years, Emily felt seen, heard, as though the world around her was real and tangible again. As the sun began to set, Emily knew it was time to return. On the ride back to the mansion, she felt a mixture of happiness and guilt. As brief as the day had been, it had reignited something within her, something that made her question everything. How could she continue in a marriage that kept her so isolated, so dimmed? When she entered the mansion, Jack was already home. He watched her carefully, noticing something different. Emily seemed less withdrawn, her movements lighter, her gaze more confident. He said nothing, but his expression hardened. A seed of doubt began to take root within him. Something was changing, and he didn't know what. Emily's transformation was subtle, but undeniable. Jack felt each change as a threat to the balance he thought he had established in their relationship. The spark in her eyes, the steadier gestures, even the more assured tone of her voice seemed to slip through his fingers, defying his control. It left him uneasy, frustrated, and above all, helpless. For the first time, he didn't know how to handle her. The next morning, after Emily returned from Tlaquepaque, Jack watched her in silence during breakfast. She seemed unaware of his gaze, lost in thought as she stirred her tea delicately. The sight irritated him deeply. "Do we have something to discuss today?" he asked abruptly, interrupting the quiet moment. Emily lifted her gaze slowly, her expression unchanged. "Not that I'm aware of." Why the question? Her calm reply only fueled Jack's irritation. He was used to Emily's immediate submission, but now she seemed unreachable, as if she had built a wall between them. He decided to take a more direct approach. "I want you to let me know before you leave again," he said, trying to sound authoritative. "It's the least bit of respect I expect in our home." Emily smiled almost imperceptibly, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Of course, Jack, I'll let you know," she replied, her tone neutral and unreadable. The answer did little to comfort him. On the contrary, Emily's ambiguity left him more unsettled. He could feel his control slipping. For years, the mansion had been his fortress, a place where every detail was within his grasp, including Emily. Now, that very space seemed to be slipping away from him, transforming into a silent battleground. The situation at work was no better. Jack began to notice suspicious glances from some of the investors during meetings. Small comments about his recent financial troubles started to surface as murmurs, and Lauren Mitchell, once his closest ally, had become a problem. She now appeared with bolder demands, constantly implying that she could reveal truths if he didn't meet her terms. "Jack, you know I'm patient," Lauren said during a private meeting. "But patience has its limits. I need guarantees that our agreements will be honored." He looked at her with a mix of rage and exhaustion. He felt cornered, and Lauren knew exactly where to press. Every one of her words was calculated, a dance of threat and promise. While trying to contain the external pressure, Jack desperately sought to regain control within his home. He tried to reach out to Emily, thinking gestures of affection might revive the dynamic they had once shared in the early days of their marriage. One night, he brought her flowers, something he hadn't done in years. "I thought of you when I saw these roses," he said, handing her the bouquet with a forced smile. Emily accepted the flowers politely, but there was no warmth in her response. "Thank you, Jack. They're beautiful." Her indifference hurt him more than any confrontation could. He didn't want to admit it, but he felt Emily slipping through his fingers, and the thought terrified him. Instead of strengthening his position, his attempts at affection only highlighted the widening rift between them. Meanwhile, the tension in the mansion was palpable. The staff, who had always maintained a neutral stance, now avoided even crossing paths with Jack. The air was thick, and the silence that once symbolized control now felt like a harbinger of something about to crumble. Even Rose, who had always been loyal to Emily, seemed more cautious in her interactions. Jack spent nights in his office, sifting through contracts and trying to find a solution to his financial woes, but his mind kept drifting back to Emily. He knew the change in her was a reflection of something larger, something beyond his control. And that feeling of helplessness gnawed at him, unbearable. That night, the atmosphere in the Carter mansion seemed heavier than ever. Emily sat in the living room, on the sofa facing the garden. Her hands rested in her lap, but her fingers moved nervously, betraying the calm she was trying to project. For weeks, she had rehearsed this moment, mentally running through each word, every argument. Now she knew she couldn't delay it any longer. Jack entered the room, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt. He seemed distracted, his face heavy with the usual concerns. Emily seized the opportunity before he could begin yet another conversation. "Jack, we need to talk," she said, her voice firm yet calm. He stopped and looked at her, surprised by the tone he rarely heard from her. Raising an eyebrow, he responded with a hint of disdain. "Tell me, Emily, about what now?" She took a deep breath, trying to control the tremor that was beginning in her voice. But this time there was no room for hesitation. "I want a divorce." The words hung in the air, cutting through even the distant sound of the wind outside. For a moment, Jack stood frozen, as if he couldn't believe what he had just heard. Then he let out a disbelieving laugh, which quickly morphed into an expression of pure anger. "Divorce? You must be joking." He crossed his arms and stepped toward her. "After everything I've done for you, do you have the audacity to say that?" Emily rose to her feet, meeting him head-on. Her heart was pounding, but her eyes were locked on his. "It's not about audacity, Jack, it's about necessity. I can't live like this anymore, trapped in rules and a life that isn't mine. I'm not the woman you think you control." Jack's anger flared with each word. He began pacing the room, gesturing wildly as he spoke. "You're ungrateful, Emily. I gave you everything. A house, security, comfort. Everything any woman could want. And now you just decide you want to leave." He stopped suddenly, his eyes narrowing as he stared at her. "That's disloyalty." Emily didn't flinch, though the weight of his words pressed heavily on her. For years, those words had intimidated her, but now they were nothing more than hollow echoes. "Don't talk to me about loyalty, Jack," she replied, her voice stronger than she expected. "I found the documents in your office. I know about your financial troubles, the money you've diverted, and I know about Lauren Mitchell." Her words hit Jack like a punch to the gut. His expression shifted from fury to surprise and then to a mix of panic and frustration. He stepped toward her, trying to regain control. "You don't understand the complexity of my life, Emily. Everything I did to protect us, to maintain our lifestyle." Emily raised her hand, cutting him off. "Don't try to justify your lies, Jack. You always said you were protecting me, but the only person you've been protecting is yourself." She stepped forward, narrowing her eyes. "I'm not afraid of you anymore, and that's why I'm leaving." Those words seemed to dismantle Jack. He took a slight step back, but quickly tried to recover, folding his arms as if to reclaim his position. "You think you can just leave? I won't allow it." His voice was thick with anger, but there was also a note of desperation. "You're my wife. You belong in this house." Emily breathed deeply, feeling the strength building within her. For the first time, his words didn't affect her. "No, Jack, I belong to myself." She passed by him, heading for the door, knowing that this was only the beginning. Jack was not the type to give up easily, and the look he cast at her as she left the room confirmed that. The next morning at the mansion began with a palpable tension. Emily was in the garden, tending to her flowers, when she heard the sound of a car approaching. She wasn't expecting visitors. She rose slowly, wiping her hands on a cloth, while Rose hurried through the hall to answer the door. On the other side stood Lauren Mitchell, dressed in an immaculate outfit and sunglasses that hid part of her calculating expression. Her smile as she crossed the threshold was sharp, like a sheathed knife. "Good morning, Rose. Is Jack here?" she asked casually, yet her tone carried an unmistakable authority. "Mr. Jack isn't home right now," Rose replied politely, but without inviting her in. Lauren, however, seemed undeterred. She passed by Rose without ceremony, making her way into the main living area with the confidence of someone who already knew the territory. Emily, watching from a distance, felt an immediate sense of discomfort at the sight of her. Lauren's presence radiated something dangerous, a mixture of charm and menace. "Emily, what a surprise to see you here!" Lauren's voice dripped with sarcasm more than a genuine greeting. Emily remained rooted where she stood, her eyes locked on the visitor. She knew this woman hadn't come by chance. "Can I help you with something, Lauren?" Emily asked, her voice steady, despite the unease she felt. Lauren removed her sunglasses, revealing a penetrating gaze. She settled on the sofa as though she owned the place, crossing her legs and leaning slightly forward. "Actually, I came to talk about Jack. But I think this conversation will be much more interesting with you," Lauren said, offering a smile that never reached her eyes. Emily hesitated for a moment before taking a seat in the chair opposite her. The tension between them hung in the air, thick and palpable, but Lauren seemed to savor it. "I don't know what you could possibly discuss with me about Jack," Emily replied, her tone neutral. "Ah, Emily, you're smarter than you let on," Lauren said, leaning even closer, her voice taking on a conspiratorial tone. "I know about Jack's troubles. I know you know too. He's in a precarious position, a position that could become even more fragile depending on your actions." Emily kept her face impassive, but inside, her heart began to race. She wasn't sure how much Lauren knew, but the intention to manipulate her was clear. "I don't know what you're talking about, Lauren," Emily replied calmly. "What happens between Jack and me is none of your business." Lauren let out a short laugh, a sound brimming with condescension. "Everything involving Jack is my business. And let's be honest, your departure will only complicate his situation further." She paused, studying Emily's reaction before continuing. "Do you really think you can leave without consequences? That he'll just let you walk away?" The weight of Lauren's words landed heavily, but Emily did not back down. "And what do you suggest? That I stay here, trapped, while you and Jack play your power games?" she retorted, the strength in her voice surprising even herself. Lauren seemed momentarily taken aback by Emily's response. She straightened on the sofa, adjusting her dress, and then flashed another controlled smile. "I'm not here to fight with you, Emily. I'm just telling you that your departure could give me even more leverage. And trust me, Jack won't like that." Emily understood the underlying message. Lauren was trying to plant doubt, to use fear as a tool of manipulation. But something in the conversation made Emily realize that Lauren underestimated her. The woman saw her only as a submissive, vulnerable wife. And that was exactly what Emily intended to use to her advantage. "Thanks for the advice, Lauren," Emily said, rising calmly from her seat. "But my problems with Jack are mine to handle, and I know exactly what I need to do." Lauren fell silent for a few seconds, her gaze fixed on Emily as if trying to decipher her. Finally, she stood, regaining her practiced smile. "Well, I hope you really know what you're doing," she said, slipping her sunglasses back on. "In the end, in this game, it's every man for himself." As Lauren left, she shot a final look at Emily, as if still attempting to gauge her strength. But this time, Emily didn't look away. She felt as though she had passed a test. Though she knew the danger hadn't passed, she now had more clarity about what needed to be done. The afternoon settled over the Carter mansion with an unsettling quiet. Emily walked down the hallway on the second floor, heading for the library, when she overheard voices coming from Jack's office. It was unusual for him to have meetings at home, which made this encounter all the more peculiar. The door was slightly ajar, and fragments of a tense conversation leaked out. "This can't go on, Jack," a male voice, unfamiliar to Emily, said with impatience. "If you don't honor these payments, it'll be over, and I refuse to lose because of your decisions." Emily stopped in the hallway, her heart pounding. For a moment she considered walking away, but something in Jack's voice held her there. "I'm aware of the gravity of the situation, Thompson," Jack responded, trying to maintain his composure. "I've taken steps to reorganize the funds. We need time, and I assure you, we'll get through this." "Time!" the man snapped, his voice growing louder. "You've diverted money from multi-million-dollar projects to fund luxuries and parties. If this gets out, it won't just be a lawsuit. You'll be destroyed publicly." Emily felt her legs weaken. She had known of some irregularities in Jack's business dealings, but hearing this so clearly was like a punch to the gut. Jack, the man who always boasted of his integrity and success, had risked it all for vanity. Before she could process what she had just heard, a new voice entered the conversation. Emily immediately recognized the sharp tone of Lauren Mitchell. "Jack, what a pleasant surprise," Lauren said, her characteristic cynical tone evident. "I knew the situation was delicate, but it seems you're in deeper than I thought." "What are you doing here, Lauren?" Jack asked, visibly irritated. "Just helping, as always," Lauren replied, walking around the office with the confidence of someone who knew she had control. "Thompson, could you give us a moment? I need to speak with Jack privately." There was a brief silence, followed by the sound of footsteps. Emily remained hidden, watching through the crack in the door as Thompson left, casting a disapproving glance at Jack before exiting. Once the door shut, Lauren took center stage, crossing her arms as she regarded Jack. "You're cornered, Jack, and I'm here to remind you that your options are limited." "I don't need your threats right now, Lauren," Jack snapped, his voice thick with frustration. "This isn't a threat, darling. It's a warning." Lauren moved closer, leaning over the desk. "I know exactly what you did. The diversions, the fraudulent contracts. I have enough documents to ruin your reputation in minutes." Jack stared at her, speechless for several seconds. Emily, watching from her hidden vantage point, felt torn between shock and the urgent desire to escape the toxic situation. It was clear that Jack's collapse was only a matter of time, and Lauren was willing to play all her cards to ensure her dominance. "What do you want?" Jack finally broke the silence, his voice laced with frustration. "Total control," Lauren replied, her smile sharp as ice. "I want unrestricted access to your business, your accounts, and everything necessary to ensure this doesn't backfire on me." She leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with cold calculation. "Or I expose you to the investors, the media, everyone." Emily could barely believe what she was hearing. For years, Jack had made her believe he was untouchable, but there he was, being manipulated by Lauren, ensnared in a web of lies of his own making. For the first time, Emily saw him clearly, not as her protector, but as a prisoner of his own ambitions. Quietly, Emily backed away from the hallway, quickly ascending the stairs. Once inside her room, she locked the door and collapsed onto the bed, her thoughts racing like a storm. She needed to leave before she was swallowed by the chaos Jack had created. Her freedom was no longer a distant hope. It was an urgent necessity. Meanwhile, in the office, Jack sat at the table, drained and defeated. Lauren had left, but her words echoed in his mind. He knew he was teetering on the edge of disaster, but amid the chaos, a thought surfaced. Reclaim Emily. Maybe if he could bring her back to his side, he could regain some semblance of control over his life. The tension in the Carter mansion had become almost unbearable. Emily had spent the last few days torn between caution and resolve, quietly preparing for her escape. With Carmen's help, she had a plan. That night, while Jack was distracted with an important meeting, she would leave and never return. Her bags were hidden discreetly in the wardrobe, and her heart raced with every passing second. But Jack was more observant than she'd given him credit for. Emily's distant behavior, combined with subtle changes in the household routine, had sparked his suspicion. When he found a note hidden in her room, a message from Carmen confirming the time of her departure, his rage erupted. He couldn't believe that Emily, the woman he thought he had complete control over, would dare to defy him so openly. Without a second thought, Jack stormed up the stairs, his heavy footsteps echoing through the silent mansion. He found Emily in her room, calmly folding clothes. The door slammed open, crashing against the wall, and he entered, his eyes blazing with fury. "Do you think you can just leave like this?" he shouted, throwing the note onto the bed. "Do you think you can abandon me like I'm nothing?" For a brief moment, Emily froze, but soon she steadied herself, turning to face him. Her gaze was unwavering despite the fear twisting in her chest. "This isn't abandonment, Jack," she said, her voice firm. "It's freedom, something you never gave me." Her words cut through him like a knife. Jack advanced toward her, his face inches from hers. His voice, once loud, now dropped to a low, menacing growl. "I gave you everything, Emily. Everything. You're ungrateful, selfish. You have no idea what I sacrificed to keep this life intact. And now you want to humiliate me by running away?" "Humiliate you?" Emily's voice trembled, but it was filled with courage. "I've spent years humiliated in this house, treated like an object. You never saw me as a person, Jack, and now there's nothing keeping me here." The confrontation escalated quickly. Jack began hurling accusations, alternating between manipulative remarks and verbal assaults. Emily, though frightened, held her ground, refusing to let him intimidate her. But before the situation could spiral further, the sound of hurried footsteps rang down the hallway. Lauren Mitchell entered the room without warning, as though she owned the place. Her face was set with purpose, and she carried a folder full of documents. "Sorry to interrupt," Lauren said with a cynical smile, "but it seems your meeting needs a little schedule adjustment, Jack." Before he could respond, other men entered the room. They were some of Jack's most influential investors, all with serious expressions. Lauren seized the confusion to open the folder and begin distributing papers. "Gentlemen, let me clarify something about our host here," she said, her voice cutting through the room. "These are detailed records of the financial misappropriations Jack has committed." She shot him a venomous glance before continuing. "A true master at hiding secrets." Lauren's words hit the room like a sentence of doom. The investors flipped through the papers, their faces morphing into shock and outrage. Jack tried to justify himself desperately, but his words were drowned out by the growing murmur of disbelief. Emily, watching the scene unfold, felt a strange mix of relief and empathy. As much as Jack had caused her pain, seeing his reputation crumble so publicly was difficult to witness, but she knew this was the moment she had been waiting for. Seizing the chaos, Emily grabbed her bags and quietly slipped out of the room. Carmen was waiting for her at the back entrance of the mansion, the car running. Without a second glance, Emily climbed into the vehicle, feeling the weight of years of submission beginning to lift. Inside the mansion, Jack remained standing, alone in the center of the room. His entire world lay in ruins, and he knew there was no one left to blame but himself. The drive to San Francisco seemed endless, but with each passing mile, Emily felt a growing sense of relief. In the passenger seat, with the wind rushing through the open window, she allowed herself a brief moment of peace, closing her eyes and letting the warmth of the sun touch her face. It was as if she was breathing for the first time in years, free from the crushing weight she had borne, living under Jack's control. Carmen drove in silence, respecting the quiet of the moment. San Francisco was everything Emily needed. A welcoming city with cobbled streets, colorful facades, and a pace of life that seemed to invite reflection. The small apartment she rented near the historic district allowed her to hear the bells of the cathedral and the laughter of people in the plazas. It wasn't luxurious, but to Emily it represented something priceless: freedom. In the early days, she explored the city, absorbing every detail with a mix of curiosity and gratitude. She wandered the streets aimlessly, feeling the warmth of the people who greeted her with smiles and small gestures of kindness. During one of these walks, she passed a local NGO offering support to women in abusive situations. The simple sign caught her attention, and an unexpected impulse urged her to enter. The reception was warm. Leah, the director of the non-profit, was a woman in her middle years with kind eyes who immediately sensed something different in Emily. After a brief conversation, Leah invited her to volunteer. "You have a strength you might not even recognize yet, Emily," Leah said. "The women here could find inspiration in your story." In the following days, Emily began working at the non-profit, starting with simple tasks, but soon becoming more deeply involved. She spoke with women facing abuse, some still trapped in toxic relationships, others recently freed but vulnerable. Emily listened attentively, offering words of encouragement and, when necessary, sharing parts of her own story. With each account she heard, she felt more connected to these women and to her own inner strength. At the same time, Emily began to rebuild relationships that had been fractured during her marriage. She reconnected with old friends and reached out to family members she had distanced herself from, either by choice or Jack's influence. One of her first visits was to her sister Isabel's house, where she was met with tears and a tight embrace. "I thought I'd never have my sister back," Isabel said, her voice breaking. Emily felt the weight of those words, but also the lightness of knowing she had a second chance to nurture those relationships. They spent hours together, talking, laughing, and remembering the happy moments of the past, things Emily had thought were lost forever. Months passed, and Emily's new life began to take shape. She transformed her experience into fuel for something greater. She organized conferences at the non-profit, focusing not only on overcoming abuse, but on the process of rediscovering who we are beyond the pain. She became an inspiration to many women still searching for the path to freedom. One morning, while sipping coffee on the terrace of her apartment, Emily noticed something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time, that didn't scare her. She knew she was in control of her life now, that every step she took would be her own, free from manipulation and fear. She began to make plans. She wanted to expand the non-profit's work, perhaps create workshops to teach skills that could help other women gain independence. She also thought about picking up painting again, something she had abandoned years ago, but which still burned within her soul like a small, persistent flame. Emily felt that at last she could look toward tomorrow with confidence and a heart unburdened. The fall of Jack Carter was as swift as his rise had been grand. The mansion that once symbolized power and control now stood empty, most of the furniture auctioned off to cover debts. Lauren Mitchell, once his closest ally, disappeared as soon as she realized he could no longer meet her demands. The investors, once loyal, abandoned him, and Jack, for the first time in his life, found himself utterly alone. In the early months, he tried to cling to whatever remained of his former influence, but each door he knocked on led to further failure. Now, in a small apartment on the outskirts of Chicago, Jack spent his days reflecting on how he had arrived at this point. Among the piles of papers from his businesses, one envelope caught his attention. It was the letter Emily had written years before, the one he had found open in his office. Reading it again was like reliving every mistake, every decision that had pushed away the only person who had ever truly mattered. Sitting at the table with a blank sheet in front of him, Jack picked up a pen and began to write. The words came slowly at first, but soon they flowed with the sincerity he rarely allowed himself. "Emily, I don't know if you'll ever find reason to forgive me, but I need to say everything I couldn't before. I spent so much time trying to control the world around me, and in the process, I lost what was most worth having, you. I realize now that my fear of losing you made me become what I feared. It wasn't you who left me, it was me who destroyed what we had." The letter was long, filled with regrets and reflections Jack had never had the courage to voice. When he finished, he folded the paper carefully and placed it in an envelope. The next morning, he sent the letter to the address he had learned from Carmen, Emily's friend. A few days later, Emily received the envelope at her small apartment in San Francisco. She recognized the handwriting immediately, and for a moment, her heart tightened. She opened the letter carefully, reading each word attentively. There was no anger in her reading, only a quiet sadness for all that could have been different. When she finished, she felt a mixture of relief and compassion. That night, Emily reflected. The pain she had carried for years no longer consumed her. It was now just a memory of a chapter she had overcome. She took a sheet of paper and began to write her response. "Jack, I received your letter and I appreciate your honesty. Forgiving you is something I choose to do, not for you, but for myself. Holding on to grudges doesn't help me move forward, and I've already decided that my future will not be defined by what we lived. I hope you find peace and a new purpose, just as I have found. However, my path now is different, and there is no going back to what we once were." She folded the letter carefully and sent it the following day. When Jack received it, he felt a mixture of relief and pain. Emily had forgiven him, but the weight of knowing they would never be together again forced him to face the reality of his loneliness. For the first time, he realized he needed to change, not to reclaim something, but to rediscover himself. Slowly, Jack began to rebuild his life. He found a small job at a modest company where no one knew about his past. Without the masks he had worn for years, he began to find small joys in the simple things: a hot cup of coffee in the morning, a casual conversation with a colleague. He discovered that, though he could never erase the mistakes of the past, he could still choose how to live the future. Meanwhile, Emily remained steadfast on her path. At the nonprofit, her presence became indispensable, and her work helped dozens of women find strength and independence. On a quiet afternoon, as she watched the movement of the main square in San Francisco, she felt a deep peace. The future was still filled with uncertainties, but she knew that now, every choice would be hers, every step toward the life she had always dreamed of.